Those are scraps, mister. I know. That's why I want them. On a Tuesday morning in April of 2011, Walter Pruitt stood in the gravel lot behind Pruitt's Machine and Repair on Route 60 outside Ashland, Ohio, and watched a 34-year-old man drag a cracked engine block out of his scrap pile without asking anybody's permission. The man had a rusted Ford 300 block under one arm and a spiral notebook wedged in his back pocket, and he was moving with the kind of quiet purpose that Walter had spent 46 years learning to either admire or worry about. He loaded the block into a Chevy pickup with 190,000 miles on it, then he came back for a second one. That was when Walter walked outside. He looked at the notebook sticking out of the man's pocket. He looked at the grease already under his fingernails at 7:15 in the morning, and the 8-year-old boy sitting in the truck cab with a booster seat and a backpack. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "What in the world are you building?" The man didn't stop loading. "A foundry." 6 weeks later, a room full of grown men would laugh at that word. If you've ever walked into a room where people had already decided what you were before you opened your mouth, this story is going to land. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on other stories we bring to you. To understand what that man carried out of there, you have to understand who Marcus Webb was in April of 2011. 2 years earlier, he'd been a machinist at Ashland Foundry Products on Cleveland Avenue, second shift, running a CNC lathe for $19.40 an hour. The plant closed in March of 2009 and moved its tooling to a facility outside Monterrey, Mexico. 411 people lost their jobs in one afternoon. Marcus was one of them. His wife Renee had died 11 months before that, in May of 2008, of a brain aneurysm that gave nobody any warning at all. She'd been a payroll clerk at Samaritan Regional Health System in Ashland. One Tuesday, she had a headache. By Thursday, she was gone. Marcus was left with a mortgage on a house at 214 Beale Avenue, a 5-year-old daughter named Kayla, and a 3-year-old son named Dre, and exactly one income, which stopped existing 10 months after his wife did. He'd taken whatever work he could find, nights at a tire shop, weekends hauling scrap for cash. By that spring, he was 3 payments behind on the house, and the letter from Huntington National Bank sitting on his kitchen counter said the 4th missed payment would trigger something with the word foreclosure in it, dated for the 14th of June. Marcus had run the numbers in that spiral notebook a dozen times. A cracked hydraulic housing, a broken transmission case, a worn-out engine block. Parts the dealers and repair shops threw away by the pound were underneath the failure, still iron, good iron, and he knew exactly what it cost to melt it, because for 6 years he'd stood on a foundry floor and watched other men do it before the jobs went to Mexico. He just hadn't told anybody that part yet. Walter Broughton didn't get an answer that morning. Marcus loaded his second block, said obliged for the scrap, and drove off with Kayla asking questions about the blocks the whole way home. Walter watched the truck pull onto Route 60 and went back inside without another word, but he wrote something down on the back of a parts invoice and put it in his shirt pocket, which was not a thing he usually did. Marcus had nobody to ask permission from. That was the plain truth of it. No father across a kitchen table turning a coffee cup a quarter turn. No wife at the sink who'd stop moving in a way that meant something. Just a rented single-story house on Beale Avenue, 2 kids asleep by 8, and a detached one-car garage out back that hadn't held a car since the transmission went out on the Buick in 2010. So he had the conversation with himself, out loud, standing in that garage on a Wednesday night after the kids were down. He said it the way he'd have said it to somebody else, because saying it to nobody felt like not saying it at all. You've got till June 14th. He'd already worked out 3 rules, the same way Warren Tolliver once handed down 3 rules to his son. He just had no one to hand them down to him, so he wrote them on a sheet of notebook paper and taped it to the wall above the workbench. 1. Nothing gets poured unless Kayla and Dre are next door to Miss Odessa Frazier, not asleep in the house, not anywhere on the property. 2.
No fire goes without a full bucket of sand and the garden hose uncoiled to the door every single time, no exceptions for being tired. 3. Every dollar spent gets written down, because a man who doesn't know his own numbers is just guessing with his kids' rent money. Miss Odessa Frazier lived at 218 Beale Avenue, 2 doors down, 71 years old, retired from 31 years at the Ashland Salvation Army thrift store, and she had informally adopted half the children on that block, the way certain women just do. When Marcus knocked on her door that Wednesday and asked if she could keep Kayla and Dre 2 or 3 evenings a week starting in May, she looked at him a long moment before she answered. "What are you fixin' to do that you don't want them around for?" "Melt iron." She didn't laugh. She said $15 a week and don't be later than 9, and that was the whole negotiation. He built the furnace out of a piece of stovepipe lined with furnace cement, welded to a steel drum base, with a blower motor scavenged off a dead box fan. 4 feet tall, ugly, standing where the Buick used to sit. On the 9th of May, with Kayla and Dre 2 doors down eating Miss Odessa's cornbread, he lit it for the first time. It failed. The first pour was a simple bracket, and the iron came out of the crucible fine, but he'd rushed the mold, and when he cracked it open, the casting had a crack running straight through it like a fault line. He tapped it on the workbench. It came apart in 2 pieces. Heat 1, $9 in propane and scrap coke, nothing to show for it. He wrote it down anyway, the way the sheet on the wall told him to.
Heat 2 went worse. He'd packed the sand too wet, and when the iron hit it, the moisture flashed to steam and blew the top of the mold apart with a bang loud enough that he heard the neighbor's dog start up 2 yards over. Nobody was hurt. Marcus stood there with sand in his hair and his heart going hard, swept it up, and didn't mention it to anybody, because there was nobody in the house to mention it to. Heat 3, the iron froze halfway down the runner and left him a cold plug shaped like a mistake. 3 heats, $26 gone, and nothing on the workbench but broken castings and a man starting to understand exactly how much a foundry floor teaches you that a factory job never does, because on the factory floor, somebody else had already solved the hard part before he ever touched the metal. He didn't quit. He sat on an overturned bucket in that garage for a while. Then he wrote 2 pages of questions in the spiral notebook, mostly about pour speed, because he had a suspicion that was where it was going wrong. The next Saturday, he was back at Pruitt Machine and Repair, this time buying a bag of foundry sand Walter kept for old customers nobody remembered anymore, and a piece of the broken bracket fell out of his coat pocket when he set his wallet on the counter. Walter picked it up before Marcus could get to it. Then the old man did something strange. He held it close to his face, turned it toward the shop window, and smelled it. "You poured this cold." Marcus stopped. "How could you know that?" Here is what almost nobody under 50 in Ashland County knew about Walter Broughton. Before he opened the machine shop in 1958, he'd spent 11 years, from 1954 to 1965, as a molder on the pouring floor at a gray iron foundry in Mansfield. He quit when a doctor looked at a chest x-ray, counted the years, and told him he could find lighter work now or find out later what silicosis felt like. So he found lighter work. He opened the machine shop, and in 43 years he had never once mentioned the first job to anybody who bought a fan belt from him. He set the broken bracket down on the counter and lowered himself onto the shop stool, taking his time about it. "Books give you a temperature, I expect. 2,600 degrees. That's right, and it's useless by itself. Books give you the number, they don't give you the hurry." For a second, he didn't look like an old man on a stool. He looked like a younger man standing on a pouring floor in Mansfield in 1958. "Iron's got a temper, son. You pour it slow because you're scared of losing control. It'll punish you for the hesitation. You had maybe 8 seconds in a mold that size. I'd guess you took 18. Marcus had taken 19. He'd timed it on the microwave clock in the kitchen window. The old man told him 3 things no manual he'd found at the library had bothered to explain: how a mold has to breathe, how you build the iron a road instead of pouring it down a hole, and how the whole business is a foot race against the metal going cold. Marcus wrote it standing right there at the counter on the back of the sand receipt.
Marcus asked the question that had been sitting in his chest for 20 minutes. "You've known I was pouring bad iron since I bought that scrap in April. Why didn't you say anything?" Walter looked out the window at his scrap pile, which was noticeably smaller than it had been 6 weeks earlier. "Figured you'd quit by the second week." He turned the broken bracket face down on the counter. "Most do." Heat 6 on the last Saturday of May came out whole. A simple mounting bracket, but clean, no crack, no cold shut, the surface smooth where it had run out of the pouring cup instead of down a rushed hole. Marcus held it up to the shop light in the garage and turned it over twice before he set it down. Kayla was 2 doors down at Miss Fraser that night, but Dre had a runny nose, and Miss Fraser had sent him home early, and he was sitting on the concrete just inside the garage door, exactly where Marcus had told him to sit, with a coloring book he wasn't looking at. He watched his father hold up a piece of gray iron like it mattered. "Is that the one that works, Daddy?" "That's the one that works, buddy." Dre didn't understand what he was looking at, not really, not at 3 going on 4, but he remembered it. Years later, he'd say that was the first time he ever saw his father's face do something he didn't have a word for yet. Heat 9 was an idler pulley bracket off a lawn tractor. Heat 14 was a mounting flange for a hydraulic cylinder, a real part that went back onto a real piece of equipment and never gave anybody trouble. And that's where Marcus hit a wall no amount of reading or garage floor practice was going to get him over. He could melt iron and pour a rough shape. He couldn't machine it to a bore tolerance in a 1-car garage with hand tools, and a casting that hasn't been machined true is just a shape with potential. He needed a lathe, a real one, with a 3-jaw chuck and enough swing to true up a housing bore. He didn't have $4,000 for a used one, and he didn't have a friend with a machine shop who owed him a favor. He had Walter Broughton, who had a Clausing 12-inch lathe sitting in the back corner of the shop that hadn't turned a full day's work in 3 years. Marcus asked him on a Tuesday morning, straight out, no notebook, no rehearsed speech. "I need to true up a bore. I can pay you shop time, or I can sweep floors for the hours instead." Walter looked at him a long moment, the same look he'd given the scrap pile back in April. "You know what happens if you break a chuck jaw on that machine." "I replace it." "Damn right you do." Walter went back to the invoice he was writing. "Tuesdays and Thursdays after 5, you touch nothing else in this shop, and you sweep whether you use the lathe or not, because I'm not running a charity, I'm running a business that happens to have a lathe standing idle." That was the whole agreement. Marcus shook his hand on it and drove home to tell Miss Fraser he'd need Tuesdays and Thursdays covered too, and to figure out for the first time since March exactly how he was going to pay her for it.
By the second week of June, Marcus had a system running on almost no margin at all. Days he hauled scrap and did whatever tire work he could pick up. Tuesdays and Thursdays after 5, he was at Pruitt's Machine and Repair on the Clausing lathe, sweeping the floor both before and after to cover the difference. Every other evening, Kayla and Dre were 2 doors down with Miss Fraser while he ran the furnace in the garage, and he was back for them by 9 sharp because that was the deal and he wasn't going to be the reason a 71-year-old regretted saying yes to him. He needed a hydraulic cylinder cap, the kind that goes on the end of a log splitter ram, worn and cracked, the exact one nobody stocked because the machine was 14 years old and out of production. The only used one within 30 miles was sitting in the parts room at Ashland Rental and Equipment on Claremont Avenue, tagged for scrap. He drove in on a Thursday morning, June 9th. 3 men were at the counter. The parts manager, a man named Dale Kessler who ran a landscaping crew of 11 trucks, and a third whose name never mattered except that he laughed too. The parts manager, a heavy-set man named Roy Tackett, who'd worked that counter for 22 years, didn't laugh first. He did something else, the thing Marcus had half braced for in the parking lot. "You still living over on Beale?" "Yes, sir." "Heard you lost the house job. Heard about your wife, too." Roy said it plain, not in kind exactly, but with the particular weight of a small town cataloging a man's misfortunes out loud in front of an audience. "What do you need?" "That cracked cylinder cap in your scrap bin, whatever it weighs." That's when Dale Kessler turned around from the counter. Dale ran 11 trucks and held court at that parts window the way some men hold court at a bar stool. "What's a man want with a busted cylinder cap?" And Marcus Webb, who could have said nothing, told the truth. "I'm making a pattern off it, pouring my own." The silence ran about 2 seconds. Then Dale Kessler started laughing, and Roy laughed along with him. And it wasn't cruel, exactly. It was the laugh of two men hearing something so far outside what they believed possible that their minds filed it as a joke before it could be filed as a fact. Dale leaned back against the counter with the ease of a man who's never had to justify an opinion in his life. "Son, I've bought parts from this counter for 30 years. You know what you just described to me? A man with 2 kids and no wife trying to run a foundry in a 1-car garage." He let that land. "That's not a business plan. That's a good way to burn your house down with your kids in it." Marcus stood there and let it pass over him. He had, in the truck, a binder with 11 completed pours logged by weight, cost, and outcome, including the 5 that failed. He could have opened that binder and buried both men in it. He didn't. He asked one question instead. "How much for the scrap cylinder cap?" Roy looked at the tag, then at Marcus, then at the $20 bill already sitting on the counter. Something in the room shifted about a 1/4 inch, though nobody in it could have said exactly what. $2. Marcus walked out with the cap under his arm. Dale said something behind him that got another laugh, and he heard it through the glass door, and he kept walking. He kept the receipt. $2, dated June 9th, 2011. It's still in a drawer on Beale Avenue. The fire happened 4 days later, on the 13th of June, 1 day past the bank's deadline. He was carrying 18 pounds of molten iron across the garage floor when his grip shifted on the ladle handle and about a cup of it came over the lip and hit the base of the workbench. Pressure-treated pine, dry, 20 years old under a coat of old paint. It didn't smolder, it caught. Marcus had the sand bucket 2 steps away because Rule 2 on the wall said it had to be, and he had the fire out in under a minute with the bucket and the garden hose both. What was left was a black scorch mark the size of a dinner plate running up the workbench leg, and a burn blister rising on the back of his left hand where a spark had caught him. Kayla and Dre were at Miss Frazier's. Nobody was hurt but him, and he told nobody about it that night, not even Miss Frazier when he picked the kids up at 9. He wrapped his hand in a dish towel and said he'd caught it on a wrench. 4 days later, Kayla found the scorch mark. She was 7, and she'd wandered into the garage on a Saturday morning looking for a jump rope, and she stood in front of that black mark on the workbench leg a long moment before she came and got him. "Daddy, what happened here?" He could have told her it was old. He didn't. "I had a fire. I put it out fast, and I wasn't hurt bad, and I should have told you and your brother about it, and I didn't. I'm sorry." Kayla looked at the burn blister on the back of his hand, mostly healed by then but still visible, and she didn't cry, and she didn't ask him to stop. She asked a different question, the kind of question a kid asks when she's already decided the answer matters more than the fear does. "Are you going to keep doing it?" "I think I have to." She nodded slowly, the way a much older person nods, and went and got a second sand bucket from under the kitchen sink without being asked and set it by the garage door next to the first one. She never mentioned it to Miss Frazier either. Some agreements don't need to be spoken to be real. That same week, the first man came asking. A neighbor 2 streets over, Terry Voss, drove into the driveway on Beale Avenue with a cracked steering knuckle in the bed of his truck and $40 folded in his shirt pocket, ready to spend. Marcus looked at it a long moment. He knew he could pour it. He was fairly sure he could pour it well. "I can't take that one." Terry's face did something complicated. "Words going around you're doing this now." "I am, just not that. Anything that carries a man's full weight on the road at speed, steering, suspension, brakes, I don't touch. Not yet, maybe not ever." Marcus put his hand flat on the tailgate. "That's not me being modest. That's me not wanting to be the reason somebody's steering fails on Route 60. Terry argued a minute, then got quiet about it and drove out of the driveway with his $40 still in his pocket. That was the first money anybody ever offered Marcus for a casting, and he watched it leave in a pickup truck. Kayla wrote it in the notebook anyway, in the margin, with a dash where a number should have gone. The letter from Huntington National Bank came on the 15th of June, 1 day past the deadline. It said the 4th missed payment had triggered a notice of default, and Marcus had 30 days to cure it, or the foreclosure process would formally begin.
Now go back 9 days to the 4th of June, 10 days before the bank's deadline, in the stretch of month that decided everything. Marcus's own truck, the Chevy with 190,000 miles that got him to scrap yards and job sites and the tire shop, through its water pump housing on a Saturday afternoon, cracked clean through the mounting flange, coolant running out across the driveway in a green stream. Without that truck, he had no way to haul scrap, no way to get to whatever day work he could find, and no way to get himself or the kids anywhere at all. He called around. A rebuild housing for that engine, if anybody had one, ran $90 plus a 2-day wait for a parts store in Mansfield to ship it over. $90 he didn't have, and 2 days he couldn't spare with the bank clock already running. He stood in the driveway with his hand still on the hood a long moment. Then he walked to the garage. He'd carved the pattern for that exact housing 3 weeks earlier off a junked one he'd bought for $1 at a salvage yard in Mifflin, on the chance this exact thing might happen, something he hadn't said out loud to anybody because there was nobody in the house old enough to say it to except a 7-year-old. Kayla was inside doing homework at the kitchen table. He knocked on the window and she looked up. "I need you on the stopwatch and the book tonight. Can you do that?" She got her coat. He charged the furnace at 6 that evening with coke and a piece of the old cracked housing itself, since it was no good for anything else. Kayla took the doorway with the composition notebook and the microwave stopwatch app on the tablet Miss Fraser had given the kids for Christmas. Dre, 4 now, had the job of watching the sand bucket, a job he took with a seriousness that Marcus's chest hurt a little to look at. Marcus packed 2 molds. In April, he had packed 1 and believed hard in it. 2 meant twice the sand and twice the work and a real chance of wasting half the heat for nothing. He packed 2 anyway because 3 failures back in May had taught him something no book had bothered to mention. The iron does not care how badly you need it to work. By 6:15, the furnace was running hard, and the color coming off the crucible was that particular orange-white that isn't quite yellow and isn't quite white. He tapped it. The stream threw sparks across the garage floor, and Kayla hit the stopwatch, and Marcus poured the first mold in one continuous motion, fast, faster than felt safe, the way a dying man on a shop stool had told him to move. Then the second. 40 minutes to cool. He cracked the first mold open with a hammer and a held breath. There was a gas hole in the flange, small, the size of a pea, sitting exactly where the mounting bolt had to seat, which is to say the one place on the entire casting where it could not possibly be. Kayla stopped writing. Marcus looked at it maybe 4 seconds, then he set it aside, picked the hammer back up, and went to the second mold. The second casting came out clean. At 9:15 that night, Marcus was at Pruitt's Machine and Repair with the shop lights on and Walter Broughton sitting on the stool by the register reading a farm equipment catalog and asking nothing because that was the arrangement, and some arrangements don't need renegotiating every time. He fitted the housing at 9:30 in his own driveway, with Kayla holding the flashlight because Dre had fallen asleep on the porch steps waiting. Bolt pattern lined up. He torqued it down, refilled the coolant, and started the engine. A thin line of green ran out from under the flange and down the side of the housing. Nobody said anything. Kayla didn't move the flashlight. Marcus crouched down and put his thumb on the joint, and it stayed there about 90 seconds while the engine idled and the leak kept coming. And those 90 seconds are the reason this story gets told at all. Then he understood. It wasn't the casting. He'd bored that bore himself 2 hours earlier on Walter's lathe and checked it twice with a caliper. It was the mating face, rough off the mold, and he hadn't dressed it flat before bolting it down, so the gasket had rolled under torque instead of seating even. Kill the engine. Give me 20 minutes. It took 22. He pulled the housing, filed the face flat against a straight edge under the flashlight beam, cut a new gasket out of a sheet of stock he kept in a coffee can, and put it all back together while his 7-year-old held the light steady and didn't say a word because she had already figured out that was her job too. Marcus drove to work Monday morning in that truck. He didn't tell anybody at the tire shop why the drive over had felt different.
He wired the $90 he hadn't had to spend into an envelope with $340 more he'd been scraping together since March, drove it to the Huntington branch on Center Street on the morning of the 14th, and paid down enough of the default that the loan officer, a woman named Patricia Enns, agreed to a modified repayment plan instead of continuing the foreclosure process. It took 19 minutes at her desk. Nobody in that branch knew that the reason he had the extra $90 was a 14-year-old truck, a piece of scrap iron, and a 7-year-old with a stopwatch. By the end of that summer, 4 neighbors had brought broken parts to the garage on Beale Avenue and left with new ones. By the following spring, there were 11 and a waiting list written on the same wall that still had the 3 rules taped to it. Marcus never charged more than a third of what a parts counter charged. Price it near retail, and he was just a slower dealer with no warranty behind him. Price it near nothing, and every man in the county would assume it was worth exactly that. A third was the number where a man saved real money and still believed he'd bought something worth having.
Kayla had taken over the notebook completely by then, and she'd started a second column of her own without being asked. What it would have cost at a counter against what it cost on Beale Avenue. At the end of 2012, she added that column up at the kitchen table and set the total in front of her father. $9,140, money that stayed in the family instead of leaving it. That October, a letter came from the homeowner's insurance carrier. 2 days later, a man from the Ashland Fire Department's inspection division called about a structure on the property. Somebody had made a report. Whoever came out to look had seen exactly one thing: a scorch mark the size of a dinner plate on a workbench leg in a detached garage with no permit for what was happening inside it. Kayla read the letter twice. Then she asked the right question. Not are we in trouble, but what makes this stop being a problem? Marcus took $40 from the coffee can and spent an hour with a legal aid attorney downtown and came home with one sentence written on the back of an envelope. You can't stop a man from filing a complaint, but you can make sure the paperwork ruins his afternoon when he tries. He'd been building that paperwork for over a year without knowing what it was for. A test bar cut off every pore, mailed to a materials lab in Akron for $4 a sample. He had a folder 2 inches thick. The man they'd laughed at on Claremont Avenue had more documentation on a cylinder cap than the rental store did. Roy Tackett called the house that winter. He didn't apologize. Roy wasn't a man who dealt in apologies. He had a pallet of factory return cores scheduled to ship back for scrap credit. 41 parts carrying factory dimensions. He offered them for nothing and wrote them off as loss. Both men understood it was a trade, not a kindness, which is exactly why it worked. Dale Kessler took 2 years. He came in alone on a Thursday in 2013 with a cracked hydraulic manifold from a mower deck under his arm, the kind of part that would have run him $400 retail. He set it on the workbench and said 4 words: "I was wrong about you." Marcus took the manifold, ran a tape over it, and said, "Come back Thursday." It cost him $60. He became a regular, and he told every landscaper he knew to go see the man on Beale Avenue. Walter Broughton died in 2019. Marcus spoke at the funeral for 2 minutes and didn't mention the lathe once, because everybody in that room already knew. Webb Custom Castings runs out of a rented bay on Claremont Avenue now. 3 employees, a waiting list, and a chalkboard from the old garage hanging by the door that nobody's ever painted over. Kayla is 19, studying materials engineering at Ohio State. Dre is 15 and already asking to run the furnace on weekends. Framed at the register is a single page from a spiral notebook. Not a good pour, the first one. 3 entries, $26, nothing. He was 34. They laughed. The bank got paid anyway. And his kids never went without a roof. Somebody laughed at you, and you did it anyway. Tell me about it in the comments. I read them.
And if you want more stories about people the room got wrong, subscribe because there's another one coming.